Welcome to the Write Good Books podcast, the audio companion to WriteGoodBooks.com, with your host Jason Bougger.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Jason, joined again by our co-host Scott Michael Childers for 2 weeks in a row. It's a record.
Our current streak.
Two episodes
in a row.
At least we're not missing weeks though.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that's like puts us one up on the competition.
We have competition?
I don't know.
Anyway,
I bet they're very villainous, whoever they are.
Speaking of villains.
No, we were talking about writing stuff before we recorded, and to be a little bit ironic, I was complaining about when a villain is too sympathetic and the audience relates too much to him. But what's funny is the book I'm working on right now is probably about that. But I'm going to forget about that book. Here, listen. I crumble it up. I'm goofy today. I'm sorry.
Jason has now discovered the fine art of Foley or sound effects.
There you go. Okay, we're going to forget about that book, though, for a little bit and talk about whether or not your villain should be too sympathetic.
Well, I think part of the issue there is defining what is too sympathetic.
That's true. I mean, well, who's your favorite villain?
My favorite villain? It's like the villain that I love to hate.
Oh, the one you like to... see, that's a good question.
Right?
See, right there.
Or is it a villain that brought
that you love to watch?
A villain that I love to see beaten.
Yeah, see, that's what we can explore on this podcast, kids.
Yeah, the villains serve a lot of different roles.
They do. I was going to say my favorite villain's probably Ric Flair, but I didn't watch wrestling wanting him to lose. Yeah. You know, that's the favorite villain you like to watch. Oh, wow. Deep.
Yeah. And see, here's the thing. For me, Dr. Doom, when written well in Marvel Comics. When not written well, I cringe.
Okay.
But that, just because he's so different than many others, right? Favorite villain. But, I'm a sucker for Saruman and Sauron, right? The evil duo in The Lord of the Rings, right? For many different reasons. One is in the movie, it's a great visual, right? But also because it kind of explores two different types of villains right there. But yeah, there can be lots of great villains, but sometimes there are villains you love to hate.
Yeah. And
then there are villains that you just enjoy their bits more than your protagonist. And that's where I think we have issues.
That's when a sympathetic villain can hurt the story. A villain who's too sympathetic could hurt the story.
Yes, and that's... let's be honest. Today, we're talking opinion, right? There are other people who probably disagree with us.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'd love to see their points of view.
Oh, always. But it's interesting because you watch... Okay, so I say the Ric Flair example. I liked watching the bad guys win when I watched wrestling as a kid. And I think the bad guys were so much better characters than the good guys. The good guys were one-dimensional. The complex bad guys, that might have worked in wrestling, but in fiction, if you're writing fiction, that could really hurt your story, I think, if your protagonist is too weak or too one-dimensional.
I think you said it right there. It's that one-dimensional, when your villains are more interesting. And by villains, we're meaning, maybe they're the antagonist in the movie, or maybe they're the antagonist in the story, or maybe they're just set dressing. But we're talking villains here specifically, not necessarily antagonists. Okay. So, but yeah, if the villains have a more interesting story than your protagonist, the person that is supposed to kind of be leading you through, I just think it's bad writing.
Yeah.
Right? If your villain is that interesting, they should be the protagonist of the story. But yeah, exactly what you said, one-dimensional. Your protagonist is just there. They're either absolutely going to take care of that villain or they're absolutely going to fail. There's no question one way or the other. There's no backstory for the hero. They're just all about, they're only defined by the villain. And we talked about kind of a separate related thing before, where all the non-protagonists are just plainly defined by the hero or the antagonist. We're talking about the opposite. Sometimes your villain characters outshine your main character.
Should we talk real quick about the role of the villain?
Yeah.
I mean, what are they there for?
Yeah, and we talked about it differently, just to open up the episode, right? There's the villains you love to hate. There's the villains you hate to love. There's the ones that are just there to chew up scenery. There's the the one-dimensional henchmen. They're the ones that are just there to move a plot forward. What role does a villain play in the greater scheme?
Sometimes the villain is the main character.
Yeah.
Friday the 13th movies. You're watching Jason,
Okay, main character, but are they the protagonist of the stories?
They're not.
And in that case, it's almost like a force of nature.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I mean, are you actually rooting for the... I guess you are rooting for the sole survivor in those movies.
It depends.
Yeah.
But again, that shows that villain is not... The villain... sometimes I hate saying villain in those type of things because it's like monster.
Yeah.
But...
So, I guess to go back to what we started with, if a villain's too sympathetic, can they be as effective as if they weren't too sympathetic, I guess? If your reader relates too much to the villain's cause, I'll go back to, like, X-Men, to Magneto. You see his backstory, at least in the movies, it's a sad backstory. And you're like, well, this guy's really not that bad of a bad guy. You see his point of view, and it's almost harder to root against him.
Well, and let's continue that. When originally introduced, that character had no backstory.
Okay.
Right? And or at least my recollection of that is in the comic books.
Okay.
In the movie, you learn that backstory really quickly in the movie. Well, not really quickly, but within that movie, you see the backstory. And so then the actions were looked at as, I don't want to say unbridled villainy, but there wasn't, it just seemed like the actions of this character are bad, right? And it created, it set a very clear example. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. You introduce that backstory with the Holocaust and all of that. It's like, oh, so here's where this villain learned how part of the world works.
Yeah.
Right? And so now those actions have a different tenor.
Yeah.
And so there's still illegal actions. There's still actions that involve kidnapping and murder and bad things. But now there's a cause.
Yeah. Part of you is thinking, well, he's not doing all bad. Or
it's where you have to come up with, do the ends justify the means?
Yeah.
And so it creates this murkiness, which in some cases makes great stories. Because now you have to deal with, on the protagonist side, how do they feel about this person with a cause? It's not just random deeds, it's now a cause.
Yeah.
However, maybe that's not the story you need to be telling at this time. Maybe you need someone who's just doing bad things so the story of the protagonist can be told, right? Whose story are you trying to tell?
Are you telling? That's something you need to ask yourself, at least after the first draft, maybe during the first draft. Whose story is this you're writing?
Yeah. And then here's another thing. You get it too far into that, then you have no empathy for your protagonist, no empathy for the hero of the story. Things have flipped, and now you have more empathy for the villain. And maybe that's what you're going for. But for me, I'm getting a little tired of this trend.
Yeah.
I think it's overdone a little bit. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not saying you can't. It's just, it seems to be like vampires were a little bit ago. And even then, they're misunderstood vampires and stuff like that. It seems to be a little overdone. And to be unique in current stories, it almost seems like you need the straightforward good guy, bad guy. It's a little weird, I know, but
Yeah. Do you think in general people still want good guy versus bad guy?
I think in some cases they do.
I think they do.
Especially the light reads,
Yeah.
right? Something that you're just reading for entertainment. You want to get through. You want some clearly defined lines: good guy, bad guy, good thing, bad thing, because you're not looking for higher meaning. You're not looking for a lesson on how the world works. Some people looking for pure entertainment. I think having clear distinctions works well.
Yeah. Sometimes it's easier to write.
It can be.
Yeah.
It can be.
Might not be easier to write well though, because then you're once again having just here's the character, everything he does is good and shiny gold armor, and then the bad guy.
And we've said here before, I know I've said it before, is that the villain is the hero of their own story, right? It's something. It's not original to me either. I cribbed it from someone else. But again, we go back to whose story are you writing?
Right.
And there's been, like, Maleficent, right, is a recent example of, this is the story of the Maleficent, who in the original Sleeping Beauty Disney movie, at least, was just pure evil. And this creates an empathetic story, a backstory. Why was she doing all of these things?
Okay.
Right? It puts a different spin on it.
Yeah.
Which, that was their whole goal, right? And then Wicked, right? The Wicked Witch of the West. In Baum's story, just bad, right? Villain. And then Wicked comes along and says, well, this is why. And then what was the Oz? There was an Oz film, I think, with James Franco recently.
Oh.
The wonderful...
Yeah, I don't...
But whatever movie that was, introduced this tragic backstory for the Wicked Witch of the West as well. And so...
sort of off topic, was Wicked Witch really that wicked? I mean...
You mean...
She just wanted those shoes.
In the movie.
In the movie. Okay.
In the book, she enslaved an entire country.
Okay, well...
Plus the flying monkeys were enslaved as well.
Okay.
So,
I guess that would be bad.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be.
But in the movie, it's like, what did she do? She just looked like a witch.
Yeah, she's green. But yeah, well, again, whose story was it in the movie? It wasn't the Wicked Witch's story. It was Dorothy's.
It was Dorothy's, yeah.
So she needed an opponent, therefore the Wicked Witch. And plus there's backstory with a house landing on her sister.
Yeah. And then wasn't the whole thing a dream anyhow at the end?
It depends how you want to interpret.
How you want to see it. Just like anything else.
But, I mean, that's a good story, right? We go from the book, which gives a really good example of why this villain is a villain and bad, to the movie where she's just a witch in a house landed on her sister, so she's angry. And then it's only hinted about how she's enslaving the population of a country, right? And so even the target audience, how much backstory that villain gets and how empathetic you make them matters. A film, you've got to establish Dorothy and then all of the sidekicks along the way. In the book, you have a little bit more time to explain how bad a person is and how that creates more empathy for Dorothy, right? You're taking empathy away from the Wicked Witch and putting it on your main character.
Yeah.
Which I like to do. I like heroes that you at least gain empathy for, right?
And you have to. If you have no empathy to your hero, no one can relate, and then it's 1980s Hulk Hogan. It's just this superhero that has no weaknesses, and
yeah, and that's another thing. I mean, you could say they're mirror images of each other, but I do think that the sympathetic villains have a place, but I do think it's being overused lately. And I have seen some comments by some readers that they want everyone to have a sympathetic background, and they don't want any real villainy. They don't want any real evil. They don't want any real bad guys. They want everyone in a story to be empathetic.
kind of like Lost.
The less said about Lost from I actually I haven't watched much of Lost, to be honest. But yeah, it's like they want everyone to have an empathetic feeling. And I'm not sure about that type of story. It works in some genres better than others.
Right. I feel like in sci-fi, fantasy, horror...
You absolutely need to have something that you're afraid of.
Right.
Otherwise, it's not a horror movie.
Right.
Or a horror story.
Yeah.
It's a thriller or something.
Yeah. And that what you're afraid of doesn't necessarily have to be a villain, so...
No.
But yeah,
But it has to be something.
Yeah. Like, would you consider... it seems like the go-to villain is always Darth Vader. Would you consider Darth Vader a sympathetic villain?
Well, that's a very good question. Because out of the first... If you watch New Hope and Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, right? The hero, as presented in those three, it's Luke Skywalker. Darth Vader is the villain, who redeems himself at the end. Spoiler alert, by the way. Right? But then you add in the prequels. Now all of a sudden that big story arc is the fall of Darth Vader.
I'm not familiar with these prequels.
Yeah, some people believe they exist, some don't. But it becomes a story of fall from grace to become a villain and then the redemption. And so the hero changes if you add in those new three movies.
Yeah. And if those would have been better presented, you could have really built him up as a sympathetic character and make his turn to the dark side more emotional.
And so the villain of the piece then becomes the Emperor.
Mm-hmm. Right? And then he's actually the villain for the whole six.
Exactly. That's where it's going. And so you see, and that's a villain. There's no empathy for that villain. Or at least I'm not seeing an attempt to make the Emperor an empathetic villain. You see...
When he unifies the galaxy as the Emperor, he's doing it for not good reason. Yeah.
It's a power grab. It's consistently shown to be a personal power grab. And so if you take that, like I said, those first three, New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Darth Vader is absolutely villain. Mm-hmm. You throw in the prequels, the Emperor is now the main villain, and it's Darth Vader's as the hero story who falls from grace and becomes saved by his son.
Wow, maybe Lucas really was a genius.
Maybe.
But that's true. It's no longer... You look at all six. We're not talking about the new ones.
It's too early to tell on those.
Yeah, that's true. You look at all six, though, and it really is Darth Vader's story. More than Luke Skywalker's. That's interesting.
Absolutely. So and that just shows when we add that background, that empathy, Darth Vader's no longer the villain. Mm-hmm. Because now we see why, and we see a redemption, and it becomes a redemption story as opposed to a hero's journey with Luke Skywalker.
Yeah.
Luke is now just a side character who provides a catalyst for that change at the end.
Yeah.
And the villain then goes to Jar Jar Binks. I mean, the Emperor.
The Emperor.
So it does show that empathetic background changes the tenor of Darth Vader, in my mind, completely.
Mm-hmm. It's just too bad they didn't do it better.
That's another episode. But I think that's a great example of one character, two different presentations. Mm-hmm. I think that's a great example of what we've been trying to say throughout this episode.
Yeah, and I suppose we're out of time now, and sorry, listeners, if we were a little scattered on this one. We kind of pulled it together at the end with the Star Wars stuff. Good job. Do you have anything else you want to add before we close things out, though?
No, wait for our prequel when it becomes that Jason is the hero of the story.
There you go.
and I'm really the villain. So just look for our prequel sometime in early 2021.
There you go. Good call. And until then, visit us on the web at writegoodbooks.com. And if you'd like to support us, check out patreon.com/writegoodbooks. We'd love to hear your feedback, so check us out, send us a note, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.
See ya.